Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. A very good morning, and you're welcome to today's Signpost webinar. We hope you're keeping safe and well wherever you're joining us from today. Today, we're going to be discussing animal welfare in the context of supports available to farmers. And optimal animal welfare is an important part of livestock farming in Ireland. And Irish farmers operate to a very high standard of animal welfare, we know, which is closely regulated by the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. And to discuss the supports available to Irish dairy, calf to beef farmers in particular, we're delighted to be joined this morning by Stephanie Ronan, who is Superintending Veterinary Inspector in the Animal Welfare Division with the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, and Robert Leonard, who is an agricultural inspector specialising in TAMS supports for farmers. Good morning, Robert and Stephanie. You're very welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Good morning.
We're also joined by Pat Murphy, who's going to be helping us out with questions. So good morning to you, Pat.
Good morning.
So maybe just before we start into the presentation, Robert and Stephanie, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing within your individual departments. Maybe Stephanie, if you could just give us an overview of the type of work that's happening in the Animal Welfare Division.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so as you said, I work in the Animal Welfare Division, and my area is the policy in relation to animal welfare for all production animals. So I cover, as well as calves, dairy cows, sheep, broilers, laying hens, everything. So we cover everything. But I suppose calf welfare is one of our key priorities. You know, calves, on-wean calves, particularly male dairy calves, because they're more vulnerable. They're one of our key priorities. So we put a lot of resources into doing checks and inspections and so on to ensure the calf welfare is optimal, which for the most part it is.
Yes, so. Great. Well, we'll hear more about that in your presentation. And Robert, you're working on the TAMS side of things, the actual supports that are available there for farmers.
I work in the AES, we call the AES division, but with TAMS in particular is the focus. My main focus is in particular on the specifications that will go with the TAMS. And for anyone who's experienced with TAMS, they'll know there's specifications for all investments. I suppose we work closely with Stephanie in ensuring that the specifications meet all the animal welfare requirements, that they're all integrated into the specification. So if you're actually building in accordance with the department specifications, it helps to meet the animal welfare requirements around the animal housing, as well as then the structural integrity of the buildings, and making sure the concrete is there, durable and good value for money.
Very good. So that's all of I know I'm familiar with the specifications are all available on the Department of Agriculture website. So a lot of excellent support available there. So Stephanie, hand over to you, and we'll speak to you after the presentation.
Okay, folks. So today, in my presentation, I'm going to cover basically what the current calf welfare legislation is, what we're working off at the moment. And then I'll go through some of the key welfare requirements. I don't have time to go through them all, but just some of them, particularly as they relate to housing and TAMS and so on. And then just at the end, just very briefly to look ahead at what might be coming down the tracks as regards the review of the EU legislation on calf welfare, which is ongoing. So firstly, the first slide then is a busy slide, but it just outlines the current legislation for calf welfare, what's currently in place. So we have two EU directives on calf welfare. The first one is Directive 58 of 1998, so it's quite an old directive, and that covers the welfare of all animals kept for farming purposes, including calves. We then have the specific Calf Welfare Directive 119 of 2008, which sets out specific requirements for calf welfare, and calves being any bovine animal under the age of 6 months of age. So that's the EU legislation. Then in Ireland, we have SI, or Statutory Instrument 311 of 2010 on the welfare of farmed animals, and that basically directly transposes the two EU directives into Irish legislation. It's pretty much a direct transposition. We also have other legislation, for example, as I'm sure you know, the Animal Health and Welfare Act from 2013, which provides the general regulatory framework for animal health and welfare. And also we have a number of regulations or statutory instruments under that Act that relate to calf welfare. For example, we have 2 SIs on painful procedures that relate to calves. So that's the actual legislation we're working off at the moment. So as regards the calf welfare requirements, firstly, to look at some of the general requirements that's in the animal welfare legislation. And what the 1998 directive says is things like all necessary steps must be taken to ensure the welfare of an animal and to ensure it's not caused any unnecessary pain and suffering. That goes without saying. But what it also says is that we must ensure that the conditions under which an animal is bred or kept must take account of its species, its degree of development and adaptation, and its physiological and ethological needs. So I suppose that means when we're keeping animals, particularly more vulnerable animals such as on-wean calves, we need to be cognizant of and take account of their specific physical needs and their behavioral needs at each stage of development, as all of these feed into the general and overall status of an animal. So that's just the first requirement, that in a general sense that's included in the regulation, but it's important to kind of keep that in our heads when we're thinking about animal welfare. Then to get on to the specifics, and again, I'm kind of focusing on the sort of the housing and the TAMS elements of the legislation. So what it says in relation to accommodation and space for calves. Calves can be kept in individual pens, but only up to 8 weeks of age. The legislation specifies the minimum pen size for calves, so the pen must be at least the length of the calf, and the width of the pen must be the height of, equal to the height of the calf at the withers. The pens cannot have solid sides, so calves need to have both visual and tactile contact with other calves. So I don't think this is a huge issue for us. It's probably it is more geared towards the veal industry as such, but just for completeness, that's what the legislation says. Group pens, which I think are more common in Irish systems. Again, the legislation specifies the amount of floor space that must be available to calves. So the table here just outlines, and just to stress this, these are the minimum requirements. So depending on the weight of the calf, the space required is somewhere between 1.5 and 1.8 meters squared. But obviously, other things have to be taken into account, such as the cubic square meters of the building and ventilation and so on, as to how many calves can be put into one floor space. So just to emphasize, that's the minimum. The legislation also specifies calves must have space to lie down, to rest, to stand up, and to groom. So this is again about, being able to behave and act normally, and they should be able to do this at the same time in a synchronized manner. Just for completeness, again, the legislation specifies that tethering is not allowed, with the exception for up to 1 hour for the purposes of feeding. Again, not an issue for us, but I just included it for completeness. As regards building materials then, the legislation specifies that calf housing must be constructed of materials that are not harmful to the calves, or not toxic or anything in any way, with no sharp edges likely to cause injury and so on. So again, I think that goes without saying. What it also says is the materials must be capable of being cleaned and disinfected. And it also says that they must be cleaned and disinfected to prevent cross-infection. So there must be a system of C&D in place. And again, that's the sort of general animal health, animal welfare interplay. You can't have good welfare without having good health, and you can't have good health without good biosecurity. And it's particularly relevant for calves because of their potential susceptibility to diseases. As regards flooring and bedding then, what the legislation says is that floors should be smooth, non-slip, and suitable and strong enough for the size and the weight of the animal. They must provide a clean and comfortable lying area for the animal that's well drained for the calf. And bedding must be provided at least for calves under 2 weeks of age. So bedding is something that comes up quite a bit. So just a little bit more on that. As we know, the type and quality and the depth of bedding material is very important for any animal, but particularly for calves. Calves spend up to 80% of their time, depending on their age, lying and resting. And bedding is extremely important from the point of view of heat loss, reducing heat loss, and its ability to absorb urine and reduce wetting. So it reduces the energy loss from the calf, and therefore the calf spends less of its energy trying to regulate its own temperature. So it's very important. Also, from a kind of normal behavior and movement point of view, a good bed will prevent a young calf in particular slipping and falling, and enable exploratory and play behavior and so on. So what the kind of normal industry guidelines recommend is about 15 centimeters of good quality straw bedding. And we talk about things like a nesting score. So a good nesting score, such as the one here. And the quality, as I've already mentioned, of the straw is very important. It's important it's dry and it's not dusty or moldy, because calves are potentially vulnerable to respiratory disease, any levels of dust will increase the risk of respiratory disease. Alternatives to straw bedding, because I know there are issues around straw supply and so on, there are alternatives available, and they can be used for older calves or in combination with straw. But just, I think, to take care with young calves that straw bedding should be prioritized for very young calves, ideally at least under 8 weeks of age. Then water, what the legislation says about water is that fresh water must be available to all calves from 2 weeks of age. In cases of hot weather or for sick calves, water must be present at all times. So some key points then around water. As we know, research shows that even if calves have ad lib access to milk, they still require and will drink water. And water is also very important for rumen development, and that's something that we want to encourage and promote. So it's important really to have water there from day one. The type and the position of the drinker is important. Again, that it's not too high, the calves can access it. And calves do, and we talk about the EFSA opinion on calf welfare later, they do prefer water from an open surface. So that's more ideal than a nipple, for example. The number of drinkers is also important, and this is something that's mentioned in the TAMS specification, just to ensure that all calves have access to it, and that there's enough in the case of where they might have more need for water, like the weather is hot if they're outside, for example, and in the case of animals with scar, and that there's a backup system, that they're checked every day, and there's a backup in case of breakdown, for example. So it's just not to forget the importance of water, even though, their main source of liquid in the early stages comes from milk. So then, as regards feed, what the legislation says is it has a number of points in relation to feed. So firstly, on colostrum, what it says is bovine colostrum must be given as soon as possible after birth, but at least within the first 6 hours of birth. So I won't go into that in any more detail. That's the very basic minimum requirements. As we all know, it's important that calves get colostrum ideally within the first 2 hours of birth, from the first milking and so on. So that's colostrum. In addition, the legislation says that all calves must be fed at least twice a day, and they must have access to feed at the same time, unless they have an automatic or an ad lib feeding system. So that's just to prevent competition and to ensure calves aren't left behind, and that they all get a chance to suckle. Then it says the diet must also be appropriate to the age, weight, and behavioural and physiological needs to promote good health and welfare. So that's kind of tying in with the point I made at the beginning. And I think, essentially that point is probably geared towards the veal industry, and where fibre, etc., is restricted. And on that point, the legislation does specify a minimum daily allowance of fibrous food for calves from 2 weeks of age, again geared towards the veal production system. But as regards the twice a day feeding, just to talk a little bit more about that, because it's something that does come up in conversations we have around milk feeding of calves. So suckling calves, as you know, normally would feed 4 to 9 times per day, depending on the breed, depending on the age and so on. And the rumen of a calf develops slowly but surely from birth up to 6 weeks. And in general, most calves won't take in a huge amount of solid feed up to about 3 weeks. So the current industry recommendation is to provide about 15% of a calf's body weight in milk per day via teeth, because the teeth is a more natural method of providing feed. And calves can't ingest all of this milk in one feed, very young calves. So the requirement is that young calves up to 4 weeks, and sometimes 6, depending on what they're eating, require 2 milk feeds per day. So once a daily milk feeding isn't permitted up to 4 weeks of age. The next requirement then, I said I'd mention, is lighting. Again, the legislation is quite general. It requires that calves are housed in well-lit housing with natural or artificial lighting, but that it's provided for a continuous period of 8 hours, and then that there's additional lighting made available for inspection purposes, for example, at any time, so portable lighting or whatever. So our interpretation of that is alighting should ideally follow a very natural pattern, and that makes sense. Obviously, to make use of natural lighting is more cost efficient and more reasonable. So it should be between 9 to 5 p.m. in line with the calves' circadian rhythm, and there should be always a period of darkness for obvious reasons, for resting and so on. The level or intensity of lighting isn't specified in the legislation, but what is out there in guidelines and in the TAMS specification is a recommended lighting intensity of 50 lux. And that allows calves to interact normally and to see their feeders and do everything they need to do. The next point then is in relation to automated or mechanical equipment. So what the legislation says is automated or mechanical equipment must be inspected at least once a day. And if any issues are noted, they must be rectified immediately, or some additional measures put in place to deal with the problem. In relation to calves, this point is probably more relatable to intensively reared systems where you might have automated ventilation and so on. But for calves, I suppose it's most relevant to automated feeders, and just to ensuring that they are maintained properly, that there's no overfeeding, that there's systems in place to check and contingencies for breakdowns or power cuts or whatever. And I think that goes without saying. It's all very automated, so I don't think that's an issue. But just to make the point as well, the legislation for calves stipulates that calves, when they're housed anyway, must be inspected twice a day. So I suppose, any level of automation doesn't substitute for that sort of stockmanship as well. And then the last slide on the legislation, what the legislation says in relation to sick or injured calves, and this is relevant in relation to isolation, the provision of isolation pens. Sick or injured animals must be treated without delay. Veterinary advice sought if they're not responding, and they must be isolated if needed with dry and comfortable bedding. So it's a kind of very general, sensible requirement around dealing with sick and injured animals. But I suppose in reality, that means that calf housing should have a separate isolation pen, and that isolation pen should provide bedding, feed, water and light to the animals that are isolated in it. And ideally, it should be, from a biosecurity point of view, be in a separate airspace with separate drainage and ideally a separate entrance. Because as you know, if you get a disease into a calf house, it can spread quite rapidly. So just on basic principles, that's the ideal. It's not specified in the legislation, but that's what is the ideal situation. And then the last point on the legislation is in relation to ventilation and environment. Again, the legislation is quite general in that it says air circulation, dust levels, temperature, relative humidity and gases must be kept within limits that are not harmful to the calves. And if there are automatic ventilation systems, which I don't think are particularly common for calves in this country, they require a backup system and an alarm to be attached to them. Again, more relevant to intensively reared species. But I suppose I put this point in because, as we know, and I'm sure anyone rearing calves know, the importance of ventilation can't be overstated. Good ventilation is vital for the removal of bacteria and other bugs, and the removal of noxious gases, reducing dust, and just keeping a good airflow generally. And just to mention, while the levels of noxious gases are not specified in the legislation, they are for some of the other species like broilers. They are something that can be used as a good indicator of any issue with ventilation. So if CO2 goes above 3,000 parts per million, then there's an issue. There's not enough oxygen in the house. And if ammonia goes anywhere above 25 parts per million, then it's going to start causing irritation to the calf's respiratory tract. So it is something that could be considered to look at in relation to calf housing. So that's just a very quick overview of the legislation, the current legislation, and what's there at the moment in relation to calf housing and tying in with TAMS. And then I just have 2 or 3 slides just to give you a little bit of an overview of what is happening at EU level and what might be coming down the tracks. So as part of the Farm to Fork, the EU Commission committed to reviewing all of the animal welfare legislation. So the whole lot, all of the species, transport and slaughter back in 2020. And what they said is that better animal welfare improves animal health as we know, and food quality, and reduces the need for medication. So very importantly, it ties in with AMR, antimicrobial resistance, and can help preserve biodiversity. And as you saw from the first slide, some of the animal welfare legislation is quite old, even though it's still very relevant. The science, if you like, of animal welfare has moved on in the last 20 years or so. So the purpose of the review is basically to align new legislation with the latest scientific evidence. As I've already mentioned, some of the legislation has been around for quite a long time. Also to broaden its scope. For example, the proposal is to have a piece of legislation, a specific piece of legislation on dairy cow welfare, because we don't actually have that at the moment. Well, dairy cow welfare is only covered by the general EU welfare directive. And then to make it easier to enforce, and so that there's a more consistent approach across member states, because that's been an issue with some legislation, and then ultimately to ensure a better standard of, or higher standard of welfare across the EU. So this slide, and apologies, it's a very busy slide, but I just thought I'd mention EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority. So the Commission asked EFSA to produce updated scientific opinions on animal welfare for the main production species and on transport as well back in 2020. And EFSA have actually published most of those opinions at this stage. So the table just gives you an idea of the species that they've looked at and when they were published. So the opinion on the welfare of calves was published back in March last year, for example. So the aim is that the EFSA opinions will form the scientific basis for the new legislation if and when it comes. Now, we were expecting legislation proposals from the Commission before Christmas, but they haven't brought those forward as yet. The only legislative proposals that have been brought forward are those on transport. And there's discussions going on at EU level on that at the moment, as you may well know, which may have an impact on our calf industry. As regards the on-farm proposals, as I said, we haven't seen them yet. The Commission have indicated they're still committed to doing it. And it's likely, if and when they come forward, we'll see things like potentially a phasing out of cages for certain species, more space for animals, greater use of what we call animal-based indicators when assessing animal welfare, and obviously also transition periods to give systems the time to adapt and so on. So it's very much up in the air as to what will happen. But in relation to calves, the EFSA opinion, the European Food Safety Scientific Opinion that was published last March, I just said I'd give you a little bit of an overview of some of the recommendations coming from it. And as I said, this is the science, and we don't know where it'll actually fall as regards to proposals if and when they do come. So some of the recommendations coming from that opinion are increasing the volume of milk being fed to calves. So feed calves 20% of their body weight in milk over the first weeks. Grouping of animals in small groups, 2 to 7 animals in the first week, and then in stable groups. So that recommendation is coming from the veal industry and the use of individual pens. So it's basically a phasing out of individual pens for calves. That's what it's recommending. Space, again, big increases in space. So they looked at the full range of what the amount of space required for calves. So this is, I suppose, more relevant to outdoor calves. 20 meters squared is what they say is actually required for full baby behavior. But for normal resting, so indoor calves and housing, 3 meters squared. So that's almost a doubling of what's currently there. So that's quite significant. Again, bedding is a feature in the opinion, the need for having a deformable, what they call deformable lying surface, ideally bedding, and the provision of water in an open surface. Again, not hugely different to what we have, but just a greater emphasis on it. And again, aimed at the veal industry, long cut roughage from 2 weeks onwards, and 1 kilo per day of fibre. So a significant increase in the amount of fibre required. And then, as I've already mentioned, a greater use of what we call animal-based indicators to assess animal welfare on farm and at slaughter as well. So that's just a very brief whistle-stop tour of the EFSA opinion on calf welfare. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. So next we have Robert, who's going to be sharing details of the actual financial supports available to farmers for ensuring these standards are met?
Thank you, Mark. I'm just going to, my name is Robert Leonard. I'm with the Department of Agriculture. What I'm going to go through today is just the TAMS schemes, just a bit of a background to them, and in particular looking at the calf and calving investment supports that are in those schemes. And then a quick look at the application process and some requirements around making the claims. Those the TAMS schemes, the new capital investment schemes, and they're to run from 2023 to the 2027. So that means they're currently open for applications and will remain open for applications up until 2027. And they are run in what we call tranches. So we've separate every 2 to 3 months, every 3 months approximately at the moment. We take in what applications are there and assess them, and then we'll issue approvals up to the value of the funding actually we have available. So what schemes are there? There's actually 10 schemes currently under the TAMS 3 umbrella. The animal welfare scheme, which is the main scheme for most farmers, that includes a lot of the calf welfare and general housing. We'll come to the specifics in a minute. The other ones with calf-related investments are the organic scheme, the women farmer scheme, young farmer scheme, and farm safety scheme. There's another series of 5 other schemes for dairy equipment, solar panels, tillage investments, and pig-related investments, and low-emission soil spreading equipment. For focus today, the particular 5 are the animal welfare, organics, women farmer, young farmer, and farm safety. So in terms of how much support is there, under the schemes, the new scheme ceiling has been reset from TAMS 2, so there is a €90,000 investment ceiling under all of the 5 schemes for all farmers, and the partnership ceiling. So for those in a registered farm partnerships, the scheme ceiling is increased to 160,000. There are separate scheme ceilings for the pig and poultry and less, and solar investments. So for animal housing, there's a €90,000 scheme ceiling for individual applicants. And the grant rates under the animal welfare scheme, which is the majority of farmers, is 40%. So that you get 40% of the cost of the investment, or up to the €90,000 ceiling if it's a larger investment than that. For the women farmer, young farmer, and organic schemes, the actual grant rate is 60% of the investment cost. But there are eligibility conditions for those. So women farmers, it must be between the ages of 18 and 66. Young farmers are farmers that have been set up within the last 5 years and have completed educational requirements, so have done required training around farming. Then the organic scheme, and to get the 60% for the organics, they must be a member of the organic farming scheme. But those are fairly straightforward to achieve. And then the farm safety scheme, which has some other investments in it, is also at 60% for all farmers. So what investments are in the actual TAMS 3 schemes? I suppose this is probably the most relevant one. There's calf housing. So that is with or without penning. It's in the animal welfare scheme, the organic scheme, the women farmer scheme, and the young farmer scheme. And we have, as mentioned, the relevant specifications. So we have S101, S102, which relate to the actual construction of the main building itself. So it's the building frame and the cladding. S124, which is actually the specification for actual calf housing itself. That actually sets out the requirements around space requirements, the quality of the all the materials used, and actually addresses the requirements around lighting and ventilation that Stephanie has actually just set out for you. So all those elements that are building related that are actually required for calf housing are actually set out in S124. So if you actually follow the department specifications, all those elements that actually have Stephanie covered will be addressed where it is around the structure of the building. So the likes of water requirements are all set out there and have to be provided to actually get the grant aid before the actual grant can be paid. There's also then specification S117, which is for organics in particular. So that sets out the additional requirements for calf housing for the organic sector, which particularly is the extra space requirements and access to open space. So there are those requirements there. And I suppose once the house is designed in accordance with those specifications, you can be confident that it will meet the requirements there for the legislation. Then there's also calf creeps. This would be for behind slatted areas where you have suckler calves. Again, they are covered under the Animal Welfare Scheme, the Organic Scheme, Women Farmer Scheme. And the main specification around calf creeps is under S123. Again, the requirements around drinkers, bedding, all of those aspects are covered in that, and that all the buildings are fully cleanable and that they have proper ventilation. Also, elements of S124 do cover in there. Also uncovered under the TAMS investments are calving pens, and the main specification there is S147, sets out the size of calving pens. S147 also covers isolation pens, so if you're need to provide isolation pens, that would be the specification to follow. We also cover calving gates, so to ensure safety of farmers during and of the animals during calving. That is covered by our specification 137. So it enables you to actually safely retain and hold cows during that. And the calving gates are designed so that if the cow goes down during calving, they can be safely released from the actual gate. Also included are automatic calf feeders and milk carts with mixers, so to enable that regular feeding of calves required by the legislation. So there's those automatic calf feeders. Also meal bins for storing meal before it is fed to the calves. You have fertility monitors then also for monitoring cows. Both dairy and beef cows are covered by that, so it's not just for a dairy side. But for today, I suppose the main focus is dairy. So looking to get cows to maximise the right breeding there. So there, calf dehorning crates. So if so the calves can be properly held and properly managed when it comes to disbudding, and multiple dehorning crates can be there to hold them for the required duration. Ear tag readers also there to enable reading of the automated tags on calves and all general livestock, and also livestock monitoring cameras. So for monitoring cows approaching calving, so you can see there and have good overview of the cows and calves at that point. Farmers need to apply online through Ag Food. So most farmers you're probably used to that. So there is a TAMS links there, and you go to the relevant scheme. And you can only apply for the list of items that are listed under TAMS, but TAMS has over 400 investment items. They're listed, and each one is listed. And applicants must receive approval before commencing work. So once you've made your application, the applications will be actually fully assessed at the end of each tranche, and then written approvals will issue. So once you get the written approval, that is when you can actually commence the actual building works at that point. The scheme operates in tranches, so we take in applications on a continual basis, but every approximately 3 months, we will select what applications have come in since the closing of the last tranche, and then we will go through those and actually issue approvals up to the value of the funding that we have available. Under the first 3 tranches of TAMS 3, all applications have been approved as there has been sufficient funding. The current tranche, which is currently open, is due to close on the 6th of September, and the subsequent tranche after that is the 6th of December. So those are already announced. So you can see how the scheme will run, and it will keep running for applications until the end of 2027. If the tranche is oversubscribed, we don't have sufficient funding, we use ranking and selection, the details of which are actually published on our website. So it is to meet certain criteria to actually manage that. And if for some reason you do not get through the first tranche, automatically it is rolled over to the next tranche. So if there is more additional funding there, you will receive approval after that. If you do not receive after the second tranche, the actual application is then reverted to draft so that you can actually make changes and issue if you want to before resubmitting your application. Just so you give an idea of the application scheme, this was actually for an equine application, but the layout is very much the same. You can see how you select the investments, you put in the proposed dimensions and your proposed cost of the element. You have different elements to link to show what drawings are needed, planning permission, farmyard plans are required. So you just put in your main investments, the sub-investments, put in the dimensions, and you also have to put in for nutrient production, so for animal housing, level of number of animals that are either outwintered or housed, the slurry storage facilities you have on the farm. And then from there, it is processed from that, so we have that required information. So when it comes to payment claims, it is important to remember, particularly for mobile equipment, and this would be in particular, I suppose, for this, for the likes of automatic calf feeders, the item must be purchased. It's not possible to use hire purchase or lease purchase because you do not own the investment. You must own the investment before the claim is submitted. The receipts must be in the applicant's name, so that is the name on the actual application. In some cases, if you're in a company, it must be the company name that the receipt is in. You must give the address that's used on the grant application, any VAT charge, the VAT number must be marked paid, have a company stamp on it, be signed, dated, legible, and with clear descriptions of the buildings and structures, including the size of volume for tanks and any serial numbers for machinery. So it is important that the name is correct as per the application under the TAMS 3. So the receipts must detail the investment supplied. And for mobile equipment, trade-ins are permitted and should be shown on the receipts, because we do check bank accounts and verify that the amounts that have gone out in relation to the receipts have been paid from the relevant bank account. And if the trade-ins are not shown, we cannot see, and then have the clear linkage for the amount shown on the receipt to the bank account. So trade-ins are permitted, but it must be like for like. So an old slurry tanker against a new slurry tanker with a less attachment is permitted. Also, with all applications, claims, you must supply a geotag photograph. This is a new requirement for TAMS 3. So the geotag photograph must show all sub-investments that have been claimed. So there may be more than one investment in one photograph. So for an animal house, you may have the animal area and feed passage shown in the one photograph. And I suppose one of the things that's come up is actually the handling of the photographs. When you're transferring the photographs, it's important to open the email app first on your photograph and attach the photograph as an attachment. Do not use the share function here to open the email app. By doing that, it actually removes the geotagging information from the photograph. So it's important to open the email app first and then add the photograph as an attachment, not to use the share option first. Because even though there is a link on that says do not remove the geotag information, it does remove it anyway. So it's important to open the email app and then attach a photograph. And so the full details of how you can set up your phones and do the data transfer is included on the department website under the TAMS 3 support documents. So where to find the information? That's under www.gov.ie/TAMS. You type it in, it'll bring you to the TAMS site. It'll also bring you to the additional information around reference costs and explanatory notes. The explanatory notes set out how to cost all the documents, what dimensions needs to be put in for each particular type of investment. It's a large document, the explanatory notes, but it's important to actually go through it because it does give you that required detail. It is divided up into sections, clearly into sections, and you will only need to go through 2 or 3 sections for any particular investment to actually submit the required details and dimensions. The reference cost document just sets out what the reference costs are. You don't actually need to refer to it during an application. It's just so you can calculate what the reference costs will be. So the TAMS website, this is just the main page. Here you can see you have a link to TAMS 3, TAMS 2, and the farm building structure specifications. So that one will bring you to all the specifications we mentioned earlier, the S101, S124 for calf housing, the S147. They're all there in numerical order. And under TAMS 3, you have all the different schemes the TAMS through support documents. There's also a link with a list of all the eligible items in each scheme. So you can actually just select the relevant scheme and it'll bring you to the terms and conditions. And when you're actually applying for it, just go on to agfood.ie, and that'll bring you into the TAMS 3 scheme, and you'll actually be able to apply under which is the relevant scheme to yourselves.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Stephanie. So it's great that you have the legislation, first of all, but then there's a supporting series of schemes there to help farmers to comply with those standards. And it's not too often you see 40% or 60% grant aid being available. So I mean, there's some fantastic measures available to farmers there. So thank you for sharing those details. We have a number of questions coming through from our audience. Just before we get to those questions, Robert, maybe you could just tell us about what level of interest has been there in those schemes to date.
To date, we've over 20,000 applications in TAMS 3s in the last just over 18 months. Okay, so it's been a huge level of interest, and we've issued over 14,000 approvals to work commence, and we've had a lot of claims are already starting to come in as well, so they're all being processed. So we're working hard to get through all those applications applications get out the approvals as quickly as possible. And there was some backlogs last year, but those really now we are getting on top of those, and they've been significantly reduced, and shouldn't be seeing those again from later on. For tranche 4, certainly forward, the applications will be being processed as quickly as they were under TAMS 2.
So typically, if I were to be sending in an application now, and sorry for getting down to the nitty gritty straight away, but just if I were to send in an application now, what sort of time frame would I expect to hear or get the green light, we'll say, from the department?
See, the tranche is closing this current tranche will close on the 6th of September. We'll be expecting to issue approvals in late October, early November for those applications.
Okay, so that's a pretty quick turnaround. So
yeah. Into November time frame is what we'll be looking at for the first ones. Okay. But just make sure your application has all the required information, all the drawings are there, and all the information is marked, that's set out in the terms and conditions are on the drawings and primary plan to speed along the application.
Stephanie, you mentioned in your introduction that compliance levels are high, but how do we compare to other countries, and what are the sort of most concerning types of non-compliances that you've come across?
I suppose we compare pretty well to other countries. We don't come across a huge number of non-compliances, but it is something we keep a very close eye on. I suppose compared to countries that have veal industries, our industry is quite different. While we, obviously calves are housed in the early stages, we do have, grass-based systems, which, mean that calves have a more natural environment, and therefore their welfare is generally better. So in a general sense, I think we compare very well to other systems.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm conscious we have questions coming in very quickly here. So Pat, I'm going to go straight over to you for those questions coming in from our viewers.
Yeah, and a number of questions. I suppose the first one relates to how long will farmers have to hold calves pre-sale going forward, or what is the thinking in relation to that?
Yeah, I suppose so currently the current transport legislation applies. So it's 10 days is the age calves have to be before they can be transported, essentially, to marts and so on. So whether that will change and what that change will be will depend on what's happening at EU level at the moment. So there are proposals in relation to transport that calves should be 5 weeks of age and 50 kilos for transport. But that is up for discussion at the moment. That's what's being discussed as part of the EU proposals on transport at the moment. So it depends where that falls. There's nuances within that as well, depending on the distance and so on, farmers transporting their own animals, but it depends where that actually falls.
While you mentioned transport there, there's a number of questions around what's likely to happen in that transport space, and is it likely that it will eventually lead to severe problems in exporting?
It's possible. I mean, it's definitely, there are challenges there based on the transport proposals that the EU have put forward. So one of the main proposals they're suggesting is that calves must be fed every 9 hours, including on a ferry journey. So that's where it's very challenging for us as a country that starts with the ferry journey. So there's a lot of work, as I think you know, being done on that. A lot of research. Teagasc are working hard to see whether we can devise successful systems for feeding calves on ferries, and there's been a few trials done. So it very much depends on how that goes, and also, as I said, where the transport proposals where they end, because that discussion is ongoing at the moment.
Okay, and I suppose for Robert, another crystal ball type question. In Ag Climatize, it mentions roofing or covering open slurry tanks. Will this recommendation ever become law, or will open storage tanks have to be roofed? And you're kind of saying that currently there's still grants on non-roofed.
Yeah, it's working. I suppose covering of stores also includes crusting over of the slurry, so that can achieve the same objective as actually a full roof. But we do actually grant aid covers over all types of stores. So the mass concrete stores, geomembrane stores, circular steel stores, you can get a grant aid for covers with those types of stores.
And while I'm with you, there's a question there in relation to the standard costings and the possibility for updating of standard costings. The comment is that they don't reflect the current building costs.
Our experience, I suppose, that they're actually fairly in line. They are going to be reviewed. We've this commitment. Minister's given a commitment they will be reviewed in the second half of this year, so that'll be starting fairly soon. But we also look back at the actual receipted costs for works actually completed, and have to look at the CSO figures and things as well. So but by and large, we have a very wide range of investments, but where one or two may be a bit out.
Okay, just a question in relation to the animal welfare provisions within the quality assurance schemes, and how likely are they to come up to fully reflect the changes in the legal position? So, Board B quality assurance are reviewing their standards at the moment. I don't know if you have any line of sight of what they're proposing. But I suppose the question is this going to come up to a full legal standard?
Well, as far as I'm aware, the Board BS standards are pretty much in line with what the legal standards are. That's the current Board BS standards. So, you know, they're
so, and in effect, I suppose for farmers, what that means is there's almost 100% for anybody in a quality assurance, they are going to be inspected on those welfare issues. So there isn't much room there for non-compliance, if you want.
Yeah, correct. And I know that the quality assurance schemes are being reviewed at the moment as well. But the current one is broadly in line with the current legislative position.
There's a couple of questions in there, and again, they're crystal ball, and I'm not sure you're going to be able to give an answer to them in relation to a 70% slurry storage grant for farmers. Is there any possibility of that?
There is, and it should be announced, so a 70% scheme for farmers importing slurry to store the imported slurry, not for just for if it's under an animal house, but it's for farmers importing slurry. Yes, we're expecting announcements over shortly on that one.
And there's a question about the level of funding of current tranches. Are they likely to continue at the current rates?
I suppose that is a crystal ball. It very much depends on, I suppose, the number of applications coming in, so the level of demand for the amount of funding. So the funding has to be spread out over the duration of the scheme. So, but it depends on demand.
A question there in relation for Stephanie in relation to provisions around dehorning and castration of animals, and what are there likely to be changes in requirements in relation to those?
Actually, we're looking at that at the moment. We carried out a review of our current legislation on calf dispudding and dehorning last year. So we are potentially looking at bringing in new requirements around that. It's something that might also come through at EU level if and when that legislation comes through, because there was a lot of discussion on it as part of the animal welfare platform last year. They had a whole meeting on what they call painful procedures. So it's something that might also come through at EU level. But again, there's a crystal ball there too. We don't know exactly what that will, what form or what level that will come at, if you like.
Okay, and sorry, go on ahead, Mark.
Yeah, just there are a number of sort of individual queries coming through here, Robert, which I'm not going to go through them all, but is there some advice or a helpline or somewhere that people can contact if they're concerned or want to follow up on a particular application?
There are contact numbers that are on our website, particularly for the TAMS, or contact your local office. If you have a particular application, haven't heard something, give your local office a call. They will be able to answer what's going on and let you know what the position actually is with an individual case. Yeah, I suppose if it may be that someone's missed a letter or something, but we're actually hopefully at this point we should be hearing in prompt time frames. So what's going on? Yeah, but do ring. By telephoning the department, we're open to that. We're delighted to take calls and address the individual issues.
Okay, great.
There's a question in there around the timeline that it takes from start to finish of the process, particularly in relation to some fairly urgent works that may be needed. And I suppose the one that's coming at us very quickly is in relation to soil water storage towards the end of this year. Is there any talk or any proposals in relation to shortening the start to finish time period where you have planning permission followed by grant application with tranches? There's some concerns in that space.
Unfortunately, I suppose the grant application process, I suppose that itself is actually has improved a lot. It's a lot better than it was. But I suppose we need to have planning permission in place before to know that the works will have the approval to go ahead. Unfortunately, until the planning is actually fully through, it may be appealed, and we would know it could be 6 months, 18 months before a final approval is given. So unfortunately, full planning is required prior to the submission of the application. So unfortunately, that we're tied to that to make sure we can issue approvals to everyone who is actually fully in position to go ahead. I suppose we have to do it in tranches because we have to extend the money out over the duration. So unfortunately, the tranche system has to stay in place.
A question there in relation to the breakdown of grants by sector. Have you any indications between dairy, tillage, beef, sheep as to what levels of applications are coming in for the various sectors?
We have them for the different schemes, but unfortunately, I suppose something like dairies are covered by a number of the different schemes, so we don't have a breakdown by sector as such. We do know the number of applications for the tillage, but then the young farmers, there's also tillage and young farmer, women farmer and organic, so not specifically by sector.
Okay, there's just a question around geotagging and possible geotag photographs and possibility of using other, now they said AgNav, but I presume they mean the AgriSnap.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we did look at using the AgriSnap, but unfortunately that the parcels have to have been claimed and paid on for the actual photographs linked to, and a lot of most farmyards are not actually in a claimed parcel, so the photographs we can't link to the actual photographs in the system. So unfortunately, it doesn't work. We had hoped to use it, so we're now using the next best option we have.
Okay, and in terms of the tranches, you said the next one is September. Is it 4 monthly tranches then after that?
The next one then is December, 6th of December, just 3 months later.
And is it seen that the tranches will continue right throughout the length of the current cap?
Yes.
Okay.
They will. They'll continue to the end of 27.
Okay, we're just coming up on time. I think we've gotten through most of the questions now at this stage. So I just want to say a huge thank you to Stephanie and Robert for joining us this morning. It's great to have as I said, the standard and then an actual a way forward with the funding and the supports that are available through TAMS. So that is great to have that combination today. So we appreciate that. Thanks again to everybody for joining us today. So next week we're going to be joined by Lance Woods from MSD Ireland, and Lance is going to be talking about how animal health can positively impact on our climate change targets. And Lance is also a Nuffield scholar, and he'll be sharing some of his experiences and thoughts around that topic. So until then, we hope you have a nice weekend. Again, Stephanie and Ronan, Robert, thanks so much for joining us today. Pat, thanks for helping out with questions. And a big thank you to Yvonne in the background, who's helping with all of the technical side of things. These webinars don't happen by accident, so there's a huge amount of work that goes around into the preparation and planning. So we really appreciate that. So thanks again. Take care.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.